Right, let's get designing, where we'll be combining various techniques to create something that looks reasonably photorealistic, at least at a glance. Now, as part of an upcoming tutorial on using multiple cursors, I created this Apple TV remote to give me some example code to work with. I thought you might find it useful to show you how the dial section was created, which, let's face it, is the really interesting part. So with that in mind, we're going to be creating this. I'll be providing the source code for the entire remote in the episode I just mentioned, which also happens to be completely size agnostic. So if you don't want to miss that, now might be a great time to subscribe. Today, however, I wanted to keep this as digestible as possible in order to clearly convey the techniques we'll be discussing. So as well as only focusing on the dial, we're not going to be basing anything on geometry readers, and instead we're just going to be plugging in values that work with a specific frame size of 400. I think that's enough talking, let's get coding, and that begins with a rounded rectangle that's going to replace that text. Rounded rectangle with a corner radius of 70. So what are we going to fill it with? Well, I want to put a gradient on this thing that is going to subtly convey the direction of the light source. And that light source is going to be coming from the top left. In order to do that, we need a gradient that is going to get darker from the top left to the bottom right. Let background gradient be equal to a linear gradient going from a white of 0.85 to a white of 0.65. And we're going to send this to the bottom trailing corner. To bottom trailing. And then we can fill our rectangle with it. Fill background gradient. And just to bring it out from the background, let's put a shadow on it. Shadow color, black, with a radius of 20, and I'm going to offset it by 10 in the X and the Y. X10, Y10. Right, here comes the exciting part, which is the dial itself. We're going to start with the outer scroll wheel dial, and before I do that, I'm just going to define a very dark color that I can use instead of black, because in this case, I don't actually want to use black as part of the design itself, just that shadow there. So I'm going to go up here and say near black is equal to a color with only 0.02 white in it. Almost black, but not quite. When it comes to shading bevels and strokes, I like to use linear gradients because I think that gives a better result than radial gradients, which I save for when I want to make something look convex or concave, as you'll see a bit later on. So I can duplicate this one, and we'll call this one outer dial gradient. And instead of going from 0.85, we'll go from 0.18, and we'll go all the way to nearly black. And now with that defined, let's create a Z stack, which is going to hold our outer dial elements. Under here, Z stack, I'll make a circle, and I'm going to fill it with the outer dial gradient. And now we want to pull it in from the edges by giving the Z stack a frame of 360. Now we need another smaller circle with the same gradient, but rotated 180 degrees. So we can duplicate that and say rotate by 180 degrees, and then we give it a frame of 290. So there you are, and if I just click up here, you can see the fruits of our labor there, and we want to convert that look into more of a pillow shape. And we do that by giving those two circles a blur. So what we're going to do is put them in a group and blur that group. So we say group, and then we give that group a blur of 16. That looks nice, but obviously we've got a bit of a problem. Because we're blurring it, it's pulling in the background color. And the way we combat this is by underlaying that circle with yet another circle with the same gradient. So as the colors are pulled through, you won't be able to tell. Now, because this means we're going to have yet another circle with this outer dial gradient, I'm going to define this as a constant that we can reuse. So I'm going to go up here and say, let outer dial circle be equal to a circle. I'm going to copy this, put it there, and then I'm going to replace these with that outer dial circle. And I'm going to stick another one there, which is unblurred. All right, and as you can see, that's brought it out really nicely. And you can really see it if I comment this out. There you are. That's what our nice shading looks like. Brilliant. If you're seeing some banding on the video, don't worry, that's just the limitations of video compression. Now, one thing you might be wondering, and it would indeed be sensible to wonder this, is why don't I have to clip that blur? Well, this is because I'm using a gradient. For some reason, when you use a gradient to fill a circle and then you put a blur on it, it restricts that blur to the extent of the circle. I don't know if this is by design or a bug, but what makes me think it's not necessarily by design is that when the gradient doesn't do anything, as in it goes from white to white, then the blur escapes the circle. So it's a little bit inconsistent, but it works for what we've got right now. I'll be filing a feedback for this regardless. In the meantime, if you have any problems, you can simply clip it to a circle. Okay, next on the list is the button in the middle, which has a concave look to it. So we're going to need another gradient, but this one is going to be a radial gradient. I'm going to put it up here, just underneath the outer dial gradient. Let inner dial gradient be equal to a radial gradient this time. And this is going to have colors going from a white of 0.14, and that is also going to go to nearly black. And in this case, we want the hotspot of this gradient to be at the bottom right because we want the light to look like it's coming from the top left. So we say that the center of this thing is equal to a unit point of 0.8 and 0.8. And then we say that we want it to start from a radius of 40 all the way to a radius of 240. And now we've got our inner dial gradient in place, we can start building the inner dial construct. So let's go below this group and put in another group. And I'm going to define the inner button like this. Inner dial gradient. And I'm going to clip that as a circle. And then I'm going to give this group a frame of 210. Why have I defined the circle that way? Well, that is because in Xcode 12, there is a problem with filling circles with radial gradients that start from a non-zero radius, as we've got right here. As you can see in this example that I've really zoomed in on to show the problem, the difference in the edges is quite stark, in that the one where we're using a radial gradient to fill a circle has soft edges in comparison, and we want nice sharp edges. A workaround that I found for this is to clip a gradient itself to a circle, which actually gives a perfect result. Now, I appreciate that the difference in the radial gradients and linear gradients we've got on screen there aren't that noticeable, but this is all about subtlety and there is a difference. If I go up to this radial gradient and I make it go from, say, 5,4, you can see it right there. It's a little bit more obvious, and a linear gradient wouldn't quite give the same effect. Let's put that back. And now we're going to concentrate on the stroke going around this inner button, which is the gap between the inner button and the outer dial. And that's nice and easy because all we need to do is stroke a circle. Let's go down here and say circle. We're going to stroke it with near black and a line width of 4. To finish off this inner button, we need some highlights because we want this to be catching the light at the top left of this inner button and at the inner side of the bottom right of the outer dial. To do that, I'm going to make another stroke, which we're going to put underneath the stroke that we just made. So I'm going to say circle, and this is just going to be a stroke. At the moment, we'll just say white color with a line width of just 1. Now it's hiding underneath our stroke, so we're going to offset it by 1.5 in both directions. Offset 1.5, 1.5. And the reason it doesn't go all the way round is because I've chosen a line width of 1. If I put this to the same stroke, then you can see it goes all the way around. It doesn't really look the way we want it to. So I'm going to put that back to 1 and we just get it in the corners. It's obviously too harsh. And as well as wanting something less obvious, we also don't want to overdo the highlights where it's dark in the top left. So I'm going to define yet another gradient. I'm going to duplicate this one. I'm going to call this one inner dial highlight gradient. And this one is going to go from 0.7 to 0.9. And then we can replace the white with that inner dial highlight gradient. And we're almost there with this highlight, but we're just going to blur it by 1. Blur 1. All right, that's much better. You can see incredibly small changes can make a really big difference. And all that's left are the dots around the edge. So let's give ourselves a little more room. And underneath this group, for each 0 to 4, index in. Each one of these is going to be a circle, which we're going to fill with a white of 0.65. Obviously, we need to do something about the size. So we give this a frame of 7. Then we need to offset it by 160 in the X. And then for each index, we're going to rotate it 90 degrees. Simple as that. And now the only thing left to do is put a shadow on the dial itself, a subtle one, but something that just brings it out ever so slightly. And rather than put a shadow on the entire Z stack, which would actually try to put shadows on everything that is non-transparent, what we're going to do is just put a shadow on the first outer dial circle. So I'm going to go up here and just say shadow with a radius of 4, with an offset in the X of 2 and in the Y of 2, just like that. It's subtle, but very nice. And now we've got everything the way we want it. I'm going to go up to these constants and move them out of the body where they belong. Now, if you're wondering why I developed the constants inside the body, then you clearly haven't seen the episode on how to code without resuming. Because I don't know if you noticed, but I didn't need to resume once over the course of the entire tutorial. So I'm going to resume one time, and then we are done. I hope you enjoyed that. If you did, drop a like on the video, and if you want the full source code for the entire size agnostic remote, then look out for that upcoming video I mentioned, and if you're not subscribed, consider doing that so you don't miss it. If you have any questions, comments or suggestions, please leave them below. But in the meantime, thanks for joining me. See you next time.